Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Economics of Information. My name is Sarah O'Keefe, and I will be doing this webcast today. This is a repeat of a session that I did at the TCOM conference and before that at Big Design in Dallas. So welcome aboard, and I hope this will be an interesting hour that we can pull together. A couple of quick housekeeping things. If you want to tweet about this, there are the Twitter IDs, and then a couple of other things. We are recording this session, and we will post the recording typically within a day or two, but give us a day or so. All participants are muted. We do encourage you to ask questions. For that, you have this questions area that's in the GoToWebinar control panel. So if you want to take just a moment to find that right now, that would probably be a good thing. We do have a lot of people on the call, and so we can't open up the audio, unfortunately. So with that, we will get started, and I believe we have to start with the vegetable section of this presentation, and that has to do with something called the text cycle. This was developed by somebody called Terje Hillesand, who is based at, I believe, Stavanger University in Norway. The text cycle basically looks at content or information as having a number of different phases that it goes through in the process of from creating it to delivering and consuming it or reading it. And of course, instead of talking about text, we really need to talk about content because we do want to include things like graphics. And perhaps in addition to reading, there might be things like watching if you're dealing with video. So reading might be more like consuming. But this is the text cycle. And if you take a look at this and we think a little bit about how this worked sort of like more at the beginning of time, before written content came along, the text cycle was all in one. The act of creating a story, producing it, storing it, representing it, distributing it, all happened in one step, which was a storyteller standing up and, around the mythical campfire and telling their story. Once written content came along, or the concept of writing, what happened was that the process of consuming the information became separated from the process of encoding or delivering it. So the person who wrote the story did not actually have to be in the same room with the person who wanted to consume the story. And so what reading allowed us to do was to separate those two acts in time. We fast forward a whole bunch more and we go to printed content around 1450 or so, and what happens now is that distribution gets separated from these other things. So with the written word, things like stone tablets and hand-copied books, the process of copying them was very, very time-consuming and was sort of bound up in the act of creating a copy. So every time you created a copy, you basically had to start over. The interesting thing about printed content was that it separated that distribution and that replication step from all the other steps. We then move forward another, 500 years or so, and what we see here is desktop publishing. So in the 1980s, along comes desktop publishing, and what you see now is that we're separating writing in perhaps a word processor from production in a desktop publishing tool of some sort. We then store the content in, let's say, a PageMaker or an InDesign or a Quark Express or a FrameMaker or even a Word, and the formatting is stored in that same file, and then we can do our distribution and our consumption from there. Now, that last little bit there where storage and representation are tied together because we were storing formatted information is then finally separated with digital text content. So now what we have is a complete separation of all of the different phases of information, creation, delivery, and consumption. And this is a key feature or a key issue that's going to drive a bunch of changes that we're looking at in our current economy. Now, I wrote digital text content here. If you think for a minute about audio, video, and graphics, then it probably looks a little bit different. In the case of creating video, once you shoot video, which would be the authoring or the writing phase, you basically have that video encoded in a video file of some sort, And so production, storage, and representation are all kind of tied together. You can't really separate out video in the same way that we can separate text from its ultimate delivery format. There are some ways to do this with audio, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but generally the text cycle for audio, video, and graphics looks more like this as opposed to the text cycle for text, where all of these things are actually separated. So I think that's about enough on the theory, and we'll move on to something a little more tasty. And I wanted to talk a little bit about change and disruptive change. So this is a lava flow in, I think, Hawaii, but I'm not actually positive where I got this image. The thing about lava is that it tends to disrupt things. It certainly disrupts roads, and sometimes it disrupts things in ways that we were not expecting or that don't become clear until later. And the example of this is here. This is a picture out of Northern Ireland, and what happened here was that there was lava that came out of the earth, out of a volcano, and it flowed down to the ocean, and when it hit the ocean it cooled very quickly, and so you got these sort of hexagonal columns that look as though they were created by, artificially, but this is in fact a completely natural phenomenon and was not touched by human hands, although it is referred to as the Giant's Causeway, because that is what it actually looks like. So I want to talk a little bit about content before Gutenberg came along, so pre-1450 or so in Europe. What we had was hand-copied manuscripts, as you probably know. Every copy was unique. Every copy was typically requested by somebody. There was no sort of making copies on spec, or there was a very limited process of doing that. Making a copy took a really, really long time. Copying things like the Bible, you're talking about something like 5 to 10 years of work by multiple people. And as a result, they had unique things that were, really kind of amazing artistic achievements. This is the Lindisfarne Gospels, handwritten, hand-illuminated. The other thing that's interesting to me is if you look on the right-hand page, you can see that there was some other text that was maybe scraped off, and that's actually the origin of the word palimpsest. So the vellum that they used was so expensive that they chose to scrape and reuse it. Here you have a picture from the Book of Kells, which you can find in Dublin at Trinity College. And again, the amount of time it probably took to produce this one carpet page is just extraordinary. And of course, they didn't have computers or various other kinds of things. This was all done by hand by people who spent years and years and years and years on it. Now here's the interior page from the Book of Kells, and this looks a little bit more regimented. I mean, you do actually have lines of text, but you still have all these decorative elements all over the place, and just lots of stuff going on, and some really pretty spectacular stuff. Before we get too far into the Gutenberg thing, I did want to point out that Gutenberg was not, in fact, the first person to invent movable type. Movable type was first seen in China this is the Diamond Sutra from 868 CE. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind, that when we talk about movable type, we're really talking about movable type in Europe and the implications there. There's some really interesting questions around why this didn't affect China in the same way that it did Western Europe, which sadly I don't have time for. So after Gutenberg comes along in Western Europe, we have printed books. It still takes a couple of years. It took about 2 years to set up the first press and to set up the first run of the Gutenberg Bible, but they were able to produce at that point theoretically unlimited copies. Interestingly, they were actually constrained in some ways by paper and the ability to get paper, which was still quite expensive and limited in supply. And the other thing I think is key here is that we're suddenly moving from a craft, or sorry, from an art to a craft. When you look at the facing pages here from the Gutenberg Bible, they're not unattractive, but they're not artistically spectacular in the same way that some of these other things were. So you know, at this point we're definitely migrating into more of a craft. There were still some interesting remnants of the artwork. So if you look at this particular example, you can see that there are some drop caps in there that are in color, and of course this sort of spectacular one down in the bottom right-hand corner. Now, what happened with the Gutenberg Bibles is that in fact they were actually commissioned. So what they did was they ran off the generic black text and then filled in these drop caps, which were left empty. So those were hand illuminated. So we had this combination of the old approach, the old technology, and the new technology, because at the time the idea that anybody would buy a book that was exactly the same as somebody else's book was just ludicrous. That's not how it's done. If you have the means to buy a book, then you buy a book that reflects your personal preferences and your color schemes and the way that you like to see things. So here's a different book with sort of a, you can see that this one has quite a different approach to the drop caps. They were done differently, you know, most likely by somebody else and presumably for somebody that had a different sort of preference. Now, this is 1450 something, 1452, 1453. By 1488, we have this. Now, this is an astrology book, and you can see that there are drop caps in here, but these drop caps were done as woodcuts, and they were integrated with the movable type. So already at this point, we've eliminated the concept of customized drop caps, customized illumination. These have been standardized in the sense that every book had the same ones. And the other thing I find interesting here is that, you know, this is sort of a reference manual, and you can already kind of see the standard layout. They've got some graphics in there, and, you know, this is not really that far from technical writing and from what we've seen in the last 100 years or so. So we fast forward 500 years, and we have something like this. So the Singer Featherweight Manual from the 1930s. We've got figures, we've got call-outs, we've got tasks, you'll notice. I don't see any steps, that is numbered steps, but they definitely have instructions. So it's not the most attractive thing I've ever seen in my life, but I do think it's humorous. Notice also that this book, it was not 8.5 by 11. It's a little book that was folded in half and landscape. Fast forward to the 60s, we have the lovely IBM Selectric documentation. We've got some bullets in here. We've got sans serif, but you know, it's really kind of sad when you think about how gorgeous this stuff was that was being produced pre-Gutenberg, and then, you know, along we go to something like this. Now, on the TechCom side, we did have, you know, some progress. We have stuff like this where they have, in fact, done some formatting and made it interesting, rather than just this really dreary, drab kind of approach to stuff. This one's really interesting. This book won an award for creativity and interesting things that you can do inside a book. So if you get a chance, you might want to go take a look at this link. It kind of explains how it all pulls together. But these days, what we are seeing is, as the pinnacle of progress, you know, is this. So a page from a Kindle book, in this case it's Kindle DX, but you know, generally a page from a Kindle is not really all that attractive. And I think many of us are looking at it and saying, this is dreary and boring, and why would anybody want this when they can have a nicely designed book? And of course, that was the question that was asked 500 years ago as well. The answer lies in this issue of quality versus cost. So when you look at these two pages, these two documents, one of these is arguably of higher artistic quality, and the other one is cheaper to produce. And I would argue not insanely unattractive. It's perfectly usable. It's just not sort of spectacular. So what happened was, after Gutenberg, the people who won in the economics of print were printers. There were obviously no printers pre-movable type era, and so this whole idea of a print shop and print distribution and information being distributed was a big deal. Literacy was a big winner. Before Gutenberg in Western Europe, there was not any particular reason to learn to read because there probably wasn't reading material that was easily available to you, so what would be the point? So the people who were literate were typically either the wealthy or scribes who were employed, whose job was to basically be literate for other people, read their letters to them, write letters back to other people. So we get printers, which means more information. We get literacy, and information becomes much more accessible. It becomes much easier to distribute information and to get it to lots and lots and lots of people, reaching far down the economic ladder from where it was before. And interestingly, newspapers came along, but it took 150 years for somebody to figure out that a newspaper might be an interesting thing to do with this printing press and this paper and all this other interesting technology that was available. So we could argue, I think, that newspapers were one of the most important developments of the printing press that was enabled by the printing press, but they did not come along immediately. In fact, sort of the opposite of immediately. Now, the losers were the scribes and the illuminators, the people whose job it was to interpret written things for other people, the people whose job it was to copy things, make hand copies, and the people who made those gorgeous drop caps and illuminations and carpet pages. There were, a good number of illuminators in Western Europe. Some of them were monks in monasteries, but there were also commercial illuminators, and that entire job just disappeared. It just went away. The other thing that became problematic was censorship and political control. So it's easier to censor and restrict information when information is scarce and hard to distribute. When information becomes easy to distribute and very cheap, it becomes much more difficult to lock it up, and therefore people have more information, and because of that the political control became more difficult. Now, as a sidebar, if you're interested in this, there's a school of thought that says that, for example, the Protestant Reformation in Europe would not have happened, or would not have happened as it did, if it had not been for the printing press, which enabled the distribution of many of those ideas across Europe. So something to think about there. Probably the most important thing I want you to take away from this presentation is actually this slide. In Europe, pre-1450, so call it 1449, 1448, somewhere around there, there were somewhere in the vicinity of 50,000 books in existence in all of Europe. And 50 years later, so by 1500, there were 12 million. And that pretty much sums up the printing press revolution. We went from, if you were a prince or a noble or somebody like that, you might have a few books. If you were a church, you might have a copy of the Bible, to a situation where there were millions and millions of books, and universities had books, and the people that were able to actually have content and have books were greatly increased. Now, jumping ahead again to our current situation, we start looking at the question of eBooks, and I have to warn you that the numbers for this are really, really hard to come by. I've had a lot of trouble finding good numbers on this. This particular chart, millions of dollars of eBook revenue estimates. There are a bunch of caveats to this. These estimates are based on wholesale. They only go through 2010 and only through 3/4 of 2010, and it's 14 U.S. publishers. So it's nothing like the entire industry, but it is a snapshot, and it gives you a pretty good idea of what's going on there. Similarly, there's this chart from a presentation that Amazon gave. That's Jeff Bezos up there. And they did not apparently release this chart, but some enterprising soul took a picture of it while the presentation was being given. So the flattish but rising yellow line that goes all the way from 1996 over to the right is the number of physical books sold at Amazon. You'll notice there's no amount shown here. They don't apparently want to disclose that. So those are actual books being sold on Amazon since 1996. And then that orange line that starts in 2008, those are Kindle books being sold at Amazon. And what this tells you is that Kindle is doing the traditional hockey stick, and has now crossed over physical books. And that was part of their announcement, was that sometime in 2010 or 2011, the number of Kindle books sold was greater than the number of physical books sold. So we're sitting right in the middle of one of these incredible transitions. And this, of course, only addresses Kindle. It doesn't talk about EPUB or any of the other book readers. So we didn't have iPads 3 years ago. We didn't have Nooks. Kindles were about 5 years ago. So what's going to happen? You know, how is this going to change? How is this rise of ebooks and the associated just huge flood of content that is available to us as readers, how is that going to change what we're doing in the world of TechCom and, you know, generally in the world of publishing? But of course my interest lies in TechCom. For starters, I think that we are going to have to streamline our publishing workflows. We have so many online formats and so many different ways that we need to deliver information that I don't think there's any question that things will keep speeding up, and we have to get rid of the manual production work in the same way that the illuminators got displaced by the not as good woodcuts and later by the no drop caps at all because it was faster. Nobody's arguing that it's better, but it was faster. And the same thing is going to be true here. We need to deliver content faster, and we need to have ways of doing that. So that does not imply that design will just go away. And certainly for one-offs like our little bookmark here, I think people will go and do those in a custom way. But when you're talking about delivering large amounts of content to the maximum number of people, possibly in multiple languages, you have got to have an efficient workflow. Now, I'm talking mostly about text. On the graphics side, there are some things that you can do to kind of help make your graphics more reusable, more efficient. Components are part of that, reusable graphic components, and layers, and of course paying attention to the localization issues when you're creating and authoring graphics. So, you know, slapping everything into a bitmap and delivering that is obviously not the way to go. Now, the other thing I think we're going to see in graphics is the rise of these more data-driven graphics that users can actually manage and customize. So I took this right off of Google Analytics just for grins. And you can see here that it made me a little pie chart. I didn't have anything to do with that pie chart, nor did I think that colors are really all that. But it did it for me based on the data and the analytics that it's bringing in. And I think that for many of us that are doing technical content, it would make sense to take a look at whether and how we can produce these kinds of things. Can you produce user customizable graphics? To give you an example, I'm starting to hear from people who have complex scientific instruments, for example, and what they want to do is expose the equations that drive those instruments and allow their end users to manipulate them. That implies that you can't just render the equation as a graphic on the page. You have to make it actually a live, interactive sort of thing. So those are the kinds of things that I kind of see coming in this space. Stepping over for a minute to audio and video, when you look at the efficiency of audio-video, we've got some issues there because the storage and the representation are usually tied together. Once you go out with a video camera and capture video, now it's digital in the sense that it's not on a piece of tape, it's a digital file, but all of the video is actually in there, and it's the sort of video equivalent of a bitmap. So what we need essentially is a way of having video that are components that we can mix and match and pull together. And there's some limited ways of doing this, but you can't really do it with most video. If you think about TV stations and those chyrons that they put that run along the bottom of the page, that's a good example where they're layering on additional information, and the video itself has, you know, all these different layers going on. But the root video, the video that was shot of some guy saying, wow, there was a lot of snow this week and I can't believe it and I have no power, that can't really be processed in any sort of useful way. If you think about text, audio books, the traditional approach to this has been for an actor, and if it's a bestseller, you know, a famous person, to go and sit in a booth and read the book, and that recording gets laid down as the audio book, and then you can listen to that audio. That is a clearly non-text cycle-separated way of doing it. The more separated way would be something like text-to-speech functionality. And of course, the quality of text-to-speech isn't anything near as high as listening to a John Lithgow, record a children's book. But the cost is, of course, much, much lower. And if all I really need is the text-to-speech because, for example, of a visual impairment, or because I don't want to pay a lot of money for an audiobook, I want it, today, then you might be looking at text-to-speech functionality. So I do think we have some issues on the audio and video side. And I know that those represent a more complex problem than encoding text, but I would point out that it can be done. What I have here is some music ML, music markup language. And the sad thing is, of course, that the code that I've put on the left represents approximately one note on the right-hand side. So this stuff is clearly extremely verbose. On the other hand, we have all sorts of room for saving, big text files. So I don't think that's really a huge problem. So as we're going along here and thinking about changes to the publishing workflow, what's happening is sort of these three things. We have roles and responsibilities that are shifting, and I think all of you are probably familiar with what's happening there. I want to talk a little bit about these other two issues, publishing velocity and content customization. I like to talk about 3 V's, velocity, volume, and versioning. These are the 3 things that affect how good your workflow needs to be. So when you start talking about velocity, what we're talking about here is the speed at which you need to produce your content. How much time do you have to create the content and get it to the content consumers? The problem you run into with velocity is that if your workflow looks something like this, then there are places that you simply cannot get to in time. You need something more like an airplane. But even an airplane at 500 miles an hour is not going to get you here. And so if you're being asked for literally the sun, moon, and the stars, then you have to come up with a workflow that gets you there as quickly as possible. So before Gutenberg, what I did here was I gave you a chart that shows how long it takes to produce a book. Pre-Gutenberg, it was 3 years per book copy, and sometimes much longer. But 3 years for copy 1, 3 years for copy 2, 3 years for copy 3, and 3 years for copy 4. So it was linear. At the time of Gutenberg, it still took about 2 years to set up the first book, so they were kind of ahead by the time even the first copy was faster. But after that, subsequent copies took a few weeks or a month, not very much time at all. And now with digital workflows, XML, and whatever else may be out there, it takes very little time to produce that first one, and subsequent copies are free. So you can produce essentially an unlimited number of copies because, of course, you don't have physical distribution. You just put it out there, and people can come and get it. So that's the velocity issue. Our velocity is clearly accelerating our ability to produce faster, and we need to think about how we can squeeze that even more. We know that the volume of data that we're dealing with is increasing. I like this quote from Eric Schmidt, the CEO of Google. It is a little questionable as to whether the exact numbers are correct, but I think the general concept is correct, that we are now producing some enormous amount of information that is way, way more than what was being previously produced. I will point out, however, that the vast majority of it is probably cat videos. On the customization side, we went from these sort of hand-copied books that were commissioned, that were customized for the buyer, to the Gutenberg Bible, which had some minimal customization, to almost no customization after that. This is something called the Luttrell Psalter. So this was a little sort of hymnal that that people would have in the family, and they would take it to chapel when they went to worship. So this one is called the Luttrell Psalter, and the reason it's called the Luttrell Psalter is because that guy on the horse is Geoffrey Luttrell, and the woman standing in front of the horse is his wife. So what we have here is Geoffrey Luttrell in his own personal psalter. So basically, he hired somebody to go and write them or copy them a psalter, and he got himself in there and his wife, and actually most of the family was in there. There were a whole bunch of people, servants. If you can go find this online, you can see all sorts of fascinating versions of it and pages. So customization, as Gutenberg comes along, we have some drop caps, but that's basically it. There wasn't a ton of customization happening there. We then move on to, our current state of events, and there we have, well, nothing, right? No customization at all happening here. So we sort of went from a lot of customization and this personalized stuff over to not a whole lot of stuff going on at all. So if you take a look at this, it looks kind of like this. Now this is design customization, okay? So what I'm talking about here is if you make a copy of the Bible, it was generally considered appropriate not to change the actual content, but the design could be all over the place. Then movable type kind of comes along, and the design customization level for a deliverable just disappears, right? I mean, we just go on and we just, we all get the same deliverables, basically. So as XML comes along and some of the digital stuff, we do have the potential here that we might be able to do more customization, that we can customize per user, or that we can give each user a different way of looking at things. Basic things like multiple CSS files that would allow somebody who's colorblind to have a nice color scheme that makes them happy, or bigger fonts for some people and smaller fonts for other people, that type of thing. Now, on the content side, there was some customization, but not a ton. There really wasn't a whole lot of customization going on. I mean, perhaps somebody would say, oh, I'd like this selection of prayers in my, in my little psalter. But, really not a lot of customization, and kind of the whole point of the printing press was to produce the same thing over and over and over again very quickly. Now, in the future, I think we're going to see an awful lot of customization of content because it can be done. So when you kind of graph these two together, I think we're going to see content go way back up. I don't think we're going to see design go way back up. It'll come up a little bit. But so these two curves are kind of mirror images of each other. Now, when you start thinking about personalization today, you get stuff like this. So, I go to Germany, I type in google.com, and it helpfully returns google.de because it knows that I'm in Germany. Now, that may or may not be what I wanted, and it's a good example of personalization that is not necessarily based on the right factors. A more sophisticated version of this is if you go to Amazon and you get recommendations based on other things that you've been reading. So you can tell probably by looking at this that I read a lot of murder mysteries, and specifically Regency murder mysteries for some reason. So I've been reading a lot of English Regency police procedurals. I'm not totally sure why, but there it is. And Amazon picks up on that and gives me other recommendations in that space. So these, sometimes they work and sometimes they fail kind of spectacularly, and sometimes they're really, really embarrassing. So that's kind of what that looks like, but they're doing, they're doing a better job. Now, they run into some problems here. Netflix in particular has some issues with their recommendations, because what happens is that if you have a family that shares an account, then it's quite common for different people in the family to have different preferences. So they really need, for example, a set of kids recommendations for all the kids' movies, and then a set of adult recommendations, and maybe you have two spouses that don't like the same kind of movies. Not that I would know anything about that. And so Netflix really has to deliver 3 sets of recommendations, and perhaps needs to get smart enough to figure out how to do that. And it's not a really obvious kind of thing. Another example I wanted to show you is something called Swim Plan, where you can go in and tell it what kind of workout you're looking for. You can tell it what equipment you have. You can tell it what you want to do. Now, the feature I would really like to see here is over there it says I want my workout core to include anything, and then you can say only freestyle, only breaststroke, only backstroke, only butterfly. Well, I need one that says anything but butterfly, and that feature is really not there. So I would like them to kind of extend this and provide some more stuff here, and maybe it's in the upgraded section. But based on what you ask for here, it will give you a recommendation and tell you what to do and how to pull this all together, and then you can print it. A lot of people bring, remember those old sheet protectors that we used to put slides into? You stick the paper in a sheet protector, stick it at the end of the pool, and off you go so that it doesn't get wet. Because, of course, paper is suboptimal for the end of the pool. And, well, an iPad or a cell phone or anything else with electronics in it that's expensive is even more suboptimal. So we've got some issues there. Now, a couple of the issues that we're facing in moving forward with this digital workflow and all this wonderful stuff have to do with search and navigation. You know, how do you navigate an eBook? How do you get around it? We know how to do this with books, and we have some pretty straightforward standards for how you navigate books and what you do for them. When books break out of that, so for example, when you have a book that's bilingual where one language starts at one end and one language starts upside down at the other end, or pop-up books, you know, people are very entertained by those kinds of things. But how do you navigate an ebook that's interactive? We don't have any standards for that. You know, Kindle has a standard, Nook has a standard, EPUB has a standard, or the iPad has a standard, but they're all kind of not the same thing, and you've got some issues there. We've got a serious issue with page numbers, especially for academics. Apparently, it is that when you have a citation, if you don't have a page number, it's not considered a real citation, and so if you're in a display that doesn't provide a citation, you've got issues. The other two I wanted to talk about that I think are important are faceted search and social search. Faceted search you've probably seen, even if you haven't heard it called that. So faceted search is like, again, this example from Amazon, where you can specify as you're searching what you're looking for. I have 10,000 results here in children's mysteries, but I could narrow it down by age range. I could narrow it down by new release, it looks like. And I can narrow it down by format, and so as I start to do that, I would get down to a much more manageable kind of list of results. So that's faceted search. Social search is where, essentially, where you ask your friends, your readers, for help. You know, anybody want to tell me stuff? What's out there? Can you recommend any books for an 8-year-old who likes mysteries? That type of thing. Faceted search you can build onto your website. Social search you kind of have to earn. So there are some issues around social search, and I think that's going to be an interesting kind of conundrum that we're going to run into. I'm not really in the habit of quoting Bill Gates approvingly, but I'm going to make an exception because back in 1999, he pointed out that the situation in developing countries is in fact quite similar to what it was in Western Europe pre-printing press. Could not afford to buy books, rarely have access to a library, and therefore what would be the point of learning to read? And ebooks, with all of their issues and all the rest of it, and I know a lot of us turn up our noses at the idea of reading on a cell phone, but if your alternative is not having access to that book at all, you might suddenly discover that reading on a cell phone is an acceptable way of doing things. So even back as early as 1999, Bill Gates did point out that ebooks are probably going to revolutionize literacy in developing countries. So that is something to think about. So the economics of digital information are that distribution, as you know, is free. There is no more distribution. You put it up on the internet somewhere and people can get to it. Essentially, distribution becomes their problem and not yours. The text cycle components are separated for text at this point. They are not completely separated for other kinds of content, and I think that that's going to hold back the other kinds of content from becoming really dominant in this digital world. I do expect to see advances in that area. I think that people will come up with ways of managing that. And in the near term, I really expect to see just a complete explosion of really, really cheap text, because the economic model tells us that that is what is going to be available. The implications of that are, you know, that's where things become interesting. What are the implications of unlimited cheap text? And I think that partly it becomes that you have to earn your readership in some way. So before I start taking your questions, I wanted to point out that we do, of course, still have hand illumination and calligraphy and all the rest of it. It's just not a major part of our economy. And although I think it would be greatly fun to work in this space, it's not a compelling business model. So for those of us who are in the business of content, we really need to think carefully about what is the digital equivalent of calligraphy, because I think that we're going to have some issues in that space. There's a question here about production, and is it really that close to the writing part? The production here doesn't refer to production in the sense of desktop publishing. It refers to production in the sense of getting words onto the page, essentially. So it's a slightly different way of looking at production. And I would take a look at the journal reference that has this sort of discussion of the complexity. Do I have any insight into solving the complexity and expense of video instructions? There's been some work done in that area by a guy named Sean Healy. He runs something called Wild Rose Productions. He's come up with a way of modularizing video so that you have these little teeny tiny snippets and then you can assemble them. That doesn't take us all the way to completely digital video, but it's an interesting approach, and you might want to take a look at that. Oh yeah, Wild Basin Media, thank you. What is the demand for video instructions? Well, you know, that's a good question that I don't know the answer to. I keep hearing that there's tons of demand for video and that people prefer video and people don't like to read. But I think that video is still quite expensive to produce, and so it's not clear to me that people are going to go in that direction when we have this text opened up that is admittedly not as good, but a lot faster and a lot cheaper. It looks to me as though, at least in general, faster and cheaper wins out over better, especially when better is way more expensive to produce. So that's kind of my take on it, but I'm not really sure. I don't know what's going to happen, and maybe somebody will come along with something really compelling in the video space, but I have not seen it at this point, which is not to say it doesn't exist. I wanted to mention that somebody came up to me after I did this presentation in Germany and said, you know, you talk about censorship and digital content and all this stuff, you know, basically being out there and nobody can control it, but, he said, in my country, and he was Russian, what the government does is manipulate search results such that you get the information that the government wants you to receive. And that was, I don't know whether that's, you know, I don't know how accurate that is. I have no insight into the Russian search engine market, but I thought it was a really interesting kind of comment and kind of a disturbing sort of thing. Okay, there's a question here about self-publishing. What are my thoughts on self-publishing? Self-publishing requires you to market your book or your content. On the other hand, unless your name is something like John Grisham, regular publishing also requires you to market your content, and you have to get past the gatekeeper. So I think that at this point, self-publishing is actually quite compelling. There are some technical obstacles, because essentially instead of hiring a publisher to get your book out there, you have to, and throwing your manuscript over the transom, you have to figure it out yourself. Now, I think a lot of people on this call are in publishing and have some experience with the various tools that are out there, so that technical obstacle isn't perhaps as big as it might be. But the marketing is the big issue. So the question is, if you have a book, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, do you have an audience? Do you know how to find your audience? If you write a fiction book that centers around a murder in an organic food co-op, then you probably want to market that over in your local organic food community. And if you have access into that community, then good for you. If you write a historical novel that's set in the Revolutionary War, where do you find the people that like to read those kinds of books? How do you get to them? How do you access them? So I would look much more at the question of how to do that. Where can you sell your book? Because if you can answer that question, you can probably solve the technical and issues around the book. But and of course, on the nonfiction side, if you're writing a book that's all about how to customize a motorcycle, then you probably want access to the motorcycle community, wherever that may be. So you need to know your audience, which I suppose that hasn't changed in pretty much ever. And you need to know how to reach them and how to be compelling to that audience. Has anyone done any research on the cost of print production versus the cost of offering electronic versions only? The people that are putting out information about this are basically publishers and fiction publishers, and they are arguing that the vast majority of the expense of producing a fiction book is not in print and distribution, and therefore they should charge nearly as much for the electronic editions as for the print editions. Now, I think nobody that's outside of a sort of fiction book publisher actually finds this argument all that credible because they're amortizing in various ways. But what I can say from our experience is that print is much more difficult than ebook publishing. So producing a nice-looking book, especially a technical book, is challenging in print and less challenging in EPUB or Kindle. Well, you can't produce an attractive Kindle book, right? So you just slap it out there. So print does add a layer of complexity, and you have to plan for it. Most of the traditional publishers, the traditional book publishers, are doing print-first workflows. Their logic is that they get all their revenue or most of their revenue off the print editions, so they design for that, and then they sort of spit out Kindle and EPUB on the back end. So that's print first. The other approach is digital first or XML first, where you go to encoding your content in a format neutral thing, not in an InDesign file, but in some sort of XML. And then you render your print, you render your Kindle, you render your ebook later as artifacts of the XML. I think it's pretty clear that that's the way the publishers need to go, but culturally, a lot of them are not ready to go in that direction. So I don't have any research that I can point you to, just some kind of anecdotal stuff. Do I see the ebook vendors finally agreeing on a single standard? Not quite yet, but I think they will. And if you look at what's happening, Kindle is now going, the Kindle format will now have HTML5, EPUB will have HTML5. It's not a single standard yet, but it does look as though they're sort of kind of starting to converge. So I think they'll get there. At the same time, HTML5 itself is kind of a mess right now and not really done. So we've got some issues in that space. Will they agree on a single standard? Yes, but you're going to have to give it, 5 or 10 years. I don't think it'll be this year or next year. So thank you for coming, and we will see you next time.